There's a moment every generation faces it, usually quietly, usually without announcement, usually in the middle of something ordinary, a kitchen table, a garage, a backyard at dusk. The moment when the person who carried the knowledge looks at the person who needs to receive it and understands that the transfer has to happen now, not because they are dying, not because the crisis has arrived, but because the world has reached a specific inflection point where the knowledge either gets transmitted completely correctly with full understanding of what it is and why it matters, or it doesn't get transmitted at all, and a generation grows up without it. Gen X is at that moment right now. The generation that survived every financial collapse of the last 50 years, that built the barter economy when banks failed, that developed the conflict resolution protocol when courts became irrelevant, that created the outside threat protocol when strangers came for what communities had built. They are at the kitchen table. They are in the garage. They're in the backyard at dusk. And they are looking at you. What they're about to give you in this final episode is not a technique, not a protocol, not a system. It is a complete architecture. Everything integrated, everything connected, everything designed not just to help you survive the next disruption, but to help the generation after you survive the one after that. This is the Gen X legacy code, and it begins with something nobody has said out loud in the entire series. Until now, here is the assumption underneath everything the series has built, the assumption that has been present, unspoken, in every episode. You think that what Gen X built was a response to crisis, that the barter economy was built because the financial system failed, that the conflict resolution protocol was built because disputes threatened communities, that the outside threat protocol was built because strangers came for what communities had. You think Gen X built these things reactively, that crisis was a teacher and survival was a curriculum. That is not what happened. The communities that survived every disruption intact, the ones that still have functioning barter networks, functioning conflict resolution systems, functioning external defense protocols. They did not build these things in response to crisis. They built them in the years before the crisis. In the ordinary years, in the years when money still worked and courts still functioned and nobody was coming for anything yet. They built them because Gen X understood something at a generational level that most people only understand after it's too late. The infrastructure resilience must be built before it is needed, not the week before, not the month before, years before, decades before, because the skills that take decades to develop cannot be acquired in weeks. The relationships that take years to build cannot be constructed in days. The culture that takes a generation to establish cannot be improvised in a crisis. And this is where the legacy code diverges from everything else this series has covered. Because the legacy code is not primarily about what you build. It is about when you build it. And there's a specific window, a specific period in every community's life, when a legacy code can be established with relative ease. Miss that window, and establishing the same architecture costs 10 times the effort. Here is where that window is, and how to know if you're still inside it. The window is called the ordinary years. And the ordinary years are defined not by the absence of problems, but by the presence of functional institutions. When the bank still opens in the morning, when the courts still function, when the supply chain still delivers, when strangers at your perimeter are probably just lost rather than assessing. These ordinary years feel permanent. They never are. Gen X knew this because they had watched the ordinary years end multiple times, in multiple ways, for multiple communities. And they knew something else too, something that makes the legacy code different from every survival manual ever written. The ordinary years are not the waiting room before the real work begins. The ordinary years are the work. Every relationship built in ordinary time is a 10 times stronger relationship than one built under pressure. Every skill learned when there is no immediate need for it is a 10 times deeper skill than one learned in crisis. Every community agreement made in calm is a 10 times more durable agreement than one made in fear. The legacy code is a complete architecture for using the ordinary years correctly, for building what needs to be built before anyone knows it needs to be built, for transmitting what needs to be transmitted before the moment of transmission becomes desperate. The Gen X legacy code has 5 pillars. And before I walk you through each one, I need to tell you something about how they relate to each other, because this is not a list. It is not 5 separate things to do. It is one integrated architecture in which each pillar supports every other pillar, and the removal of any one pillar weakens all the others. Think of it as a building. The foundation, the resource architecture, the physical layer of survival, what you have, what you can produce, what you can exchange. Everything from episodes 1 and 3 lives here. The walls, the relationship architecture, the social layer of survival, the network, the favor economy, the outer ring, the trust infrastructure. Everything from episodes 1 and 2 lives here. The roof, the resolution architecture, the governance layer of survival, the conflict protocol, the dignity principle, the reckoning, the outside threat protocol. Everything from episodes 2 and 3 lives here. The interior, the transmission architecture, the generational layer of survival, how the knowledge moves from those who have it to those who need it. This is new. This is what this episode adds to the full architecture. And threading through all 4, the load-bearing element that makes the whole structure functional. The identity architecture, the answer to the question every community must answer before any other architecture can stand on it. Who are we? What do we stand for? What do we refuse? What do we protect at all costs? The identity architecture is the piece that most survival content never addresses. And it is the piece that determines whether the other 4 pillars stand for a year or stand for a generation. Because a community without a clear, shared, deeply held identity makes inconsistent decisions under pressure, and inconsistent decisions under pressure destroy the other 4 architectures one by one. Here is what the identity architecture actually contains and how genx built it. Pillar 1, resource architecture, what the community has, produces, exchanges, and protects. The 3-layer barter system from episode 1, the trade stack, the skill hierarchy, the commodity intelligence. This pillar answers a question. Can this community sustain itself physically? Pillar 2, relationship architecture, who the community is connected to, how trust is maintained, how social capital accumulates and circulates. The favor economy, the outer ring, the tier disclosure protocol. This pillar answers a question. Can this community sustain itself socially? Pillar 3, resolution architecture, how the community handles internal conflict and external pressure. The dignity principle, the 7 words, the reckoning, the outside threat protocol, the unified face. This pillar answers a question. Can this community sustain itself under pressure? Pillar 4, transmission architecture, how the community moves its knowledge forward in time. The specific practices that ensure what one generation has learned is available to the next. This pillar answers a question. Can this community sustain itself across generations? Pillar 5, identity architecture, what the community knows about itself at the deepest level, its values, its boundaries, its purpose, its non-negotiables. This pillar answers a question. Does this community know what it is? Pillar 4, the transmission architecture, because this is the new piece. The piece that makes everything last. Everything in the first 3 pillars, every technique, every protocol, every principle, exists inside human beings, not in books, not in databases, not in any storage medium that survives independently of the person who carries it. It lives in a specific combination of experience, practice, and applied understanding that builds up in a person over years of doing the work, which means that every community faces the same fundamental challenge. The knowledge dies with the generation that holds it, unless the transmission architecture is built and maintained. genx understood this with the specific urgency of a generation that had watched knowledge disappear. They had watched their own parents' generation take practical survival skills to their graves because there was no honor transmission pathway, because the culture said those skills were obsolete, because the comfortable institutional world made practical knowledge seem embarrassingly unnecessary. And then the institutions started failing, and the practical knowledge that was supposed to be obsolete became the most valuable thing in any room. genx built the transmission architecture to ensure this never happened again. It has 4 components. Transmission component 1, the apprenticeship model. Not formal apprenticeship, not certificated, institutionalized, structured programs. the specific and formal arrangement, where someone who knows does their work in the presence of someone who needs to learn, and allows the learning to happen through proximity rather than instruction. The mechanic, who lets the teenager hand tools while the engine is being fixed. The gardener, who invites the neighbor's child to be present during the harvest. The mediator, who brings a younger community member to the debrief after every significant conflict resolution. In each case, the knowledge transmits not through explicit teaching, but through witness practice, the most ancient and most reliable learning pathway that human beings have. Gen X communities formalize this informally, meaning they made it a community expectation that every person who held significant knowledge would maintain at least one apprenticeship relationship, not as a burden. As a recognition that knowledge held without a designated receiver is knowledge scheduled for extinction. But the apprenticeship model has a specific failure point that Gen X identified through watching it go wrong. A failure point so counterintuitive that most people do exactly the wrong thing when they encounter it. And this failure point is the reason most informal knowledge transmission breaks down before the transfer is complete. Here is what it is and exactly how to prevent it. The apprenticeship failure point. The failure point is not inadequate teaching. It is premature independence. In every apprenticeship relationship, formal or informal, there comes a moment when the learner demonstrates competence at the surface level of the skill. They can perform the basic version of the task. They can execute the technique under normal conditions. And at this moment, the most common response from both teacher and learner is to declare the transmission complete. It is not complete. Surface competence is not the same as deep competence. Executing a technique under normal conditions is not the same as applying a principle under pressure. Knowing how to run the 7-item assessment checklist on a cooperative stranger is not the same as running on a stranger whose story is inconsistent and whose group dynamic is unclear and whose psychological need is buried under 3 layers of performance. Gen X's transmission architecture required a specific additional step before any apprenticeship was considered complete. The pressure test. The learner had to demonstrate the skill under conditions of genuine difficulty, not simulated difficulty, but real situations where the outcome was uncertain and the stakes were real, not to create artificial hardship. But because knowledge that has only been tested in easy conditions is not knowledge that can be trusted in hard ones. Transmission component 2, story library. Gen X communities built what they called informally a story library, a maintained collection of specific community stories about specific situations that have been faced and navigated, told and retold in community gatherings, preserving not just the outcome but the reasoning, the feeling, the specific moment of decision that determined the outcome. Not history lessons, not cautionary tales told by authority figures. Stories told by the people who lived them, with full emotional honesty about what they were thinking, what they were afraid of, what they almost did wrong, and what they actually did. The story library served 3 functions simultaneously. First, it preserved knowledge in a format that human memory retains most reliably. Not rules, not lists, not protocols. Stories, the specific narrative format that the human brain was designed to encode and retrieve. Second, it created a community identity through shared narrative. The community knew what it had faced and how it had responded. That knowledge, that we have been through hard things and we know how to handle them, was itself a form of resilience. Third, it transmitted the emotional component of knowledge that formal instruction never captures. The fear that was present before the correct decision was made. The temptation toward the wrong response that had to be resisted. The specific human difficulty of doing the right thing in a hard moment. This emotional component is the difference between knowing a technique and being able to apply it when your hands are shaking. Transmission component 3, the role succession protocol. Every significant role in the Gen X community architecture had a designated successor, not an heir, not an anointed replacement. A successor in training. Someone who shadowed the role holder, attended the same meetings, received the same information, participated in the same decisions, and was gradually given increasing responsibility for the role's functions over a period of months or years. The role succession protocol meant that no single person's departure, through illness, death, relocation, or simple burnout, could create a vacuum in the community's functional architecture. Gen X called this single point of failure prevention. A community with one person who knows how to purify water is one illness away from a water crisis. A community with 3 people who know how to purify water, 2 of whom learned it through the apprenticeship model with the first, is a community whose water security is genuinely resilient. Single point of failure prevention was applied to every critical community function: medical knowledge, mechanical knowledge, conflict resolution, perimeter management, trade network maintenance, food preservation. For every critical function, the rule was simple. If only one person in your community knows how to do something essential, that is an emergency, treat it like one. Transmission Component 4, the annual architecture review. Once a year, in calm conditions, not in crisis, the community's full core network gather for what genx call the architecture review, a structured conversation about the state of all 5 pillars. Not a complaint session, not a crisis meeting, a genuine inventory. Is the resource architecture healthy? Where are the gaps? Is the relationship architecture maintained? Which connections have weakened? Is the resolution architecture functional? Have the protocols been practiced recently? Is the transmission architecture working? Is every critical knowledge holder matched with successor? Is the identity architecture clear? Has the community drifted from its core values in the past year? The annual architecture review was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was a specific functional discipline of a community that had committed to treating its own resilience as infrastructure requiring regular maintenance, not as a quality that either exists or doesn't. Pillar 5, the identity architecture. This is a pillar that holds everything else up, and it is the hardest one to build because it requires a kind of honesty that most communities never achieve about themselves. The identity architecture is a community's answer to 5 questions. These questions must be answered in calm conditions, written down, discussed until every core member can state the answers without hesitation, returned annually and confirmed or revised as the community evolves. Identity question 1. What are we for? Not what are we against? Not what are we afraid of? What positive vision of human life are we trying to sustain? What does a good day in this community look like? What are we building toward? Communities that can only define themselves by what they oppose, by external threats and internal rules, do not have identity. They have anxiety. And anxiety-based communities make the worst decisions under pressure. Identity question 2. What do we not compromise? Every community has non-negotiables. Things it will not do regardless of pressure. Things it will not become regardless of circumstance. These non-negotiables must be identified, named, and agreed upon in calm conditions, because under pressure, non-negotiables are tested. And communities that haven't identified them in advance discover their non-negotiables at the worst possible time, in the middle of crisis decision, when the temptation to compromise is at its highest and the cost of discovering what you stand for is potentially catastrophic. Identity question 3. Who belongs here? Not a question about exclusion. A question about belonging. What does it mean to be a full member of this community? What is expected? What is offered in return? What is the path for someone who wants to join? Communities that have never answered this question make inconsistent membership decisions, welcoming some people who damage the network, excluding others who would have strengthened it, making each decision based on the specific emotional state of whoever happens to be at the gate that day. Identity question 4. How we make decisions. Not who makes decisions. How? What is the process? Who is consulted? How are disagreements resolved? What happens when the designated decision-maker is unavailable? Communities without a clear answer to this question develop informal power structures that become invisible and unaccountable, and eventually corrupt because unaccountable power in a small community corrodes exactly the trust that makes the community functional. Identity question 5. What do we owe the next generation? This is the question that transforms a survival community into a legacy community. The answer to this question is not material. It is not land or resources or physical infrastructure, though those may be part of it. The answer is knowledge, protocol, story, the specific, hard-won understanding of how to sustain human community through difficulty that Gen X developed across 50 years of being tested by circumstance. What you owe the next generation is a complete architecture, not a sanitized version, not the easy parts. The complete thing, including the parts that are uncomfortable, including the mistakes that were made and learned from, including the full emotional truth of what it costs and what it gives to carry this knowledge and apply it. The genx Legacy Code, complete implementation. Immediate this week. Answer the 5 identity questions. Not alone, with your core network. In a single sitting if possible. Write the answers down. Not as a formal document, as a living record that belongs to everyone who contributed to it. This conversation will be uncomfortable. It will surface disagreements you didn't know existed. It will reveal assumptions people have been holding privately that conflict with each other. Have it anyway, because the disagreements that surface in this conversation in calm conditions are manageable. The same disagreements surfacing for the first time in a crisis are community ending. This month, conduct a single point of failure audit for every critical function in your community. Identify who holds a knowledge. If the answer is one person, you have a vulnerability. Begin the apprenticeship process immediately, not formally. Just come watch me do this. Ask questions. I'll explain what I'm thinking as I go. That is the entire initiation of an apprenticeship. Presence plus openness. The rest follows. This quarter, begin your story library. Start with 3 stories. Your own if you have them. The community's if it has them. The elders if you have access to one. 3 stories of difficulty navigated, told with full emotional honesty about what was hard, what was tempting, what was ultimately done and why. Record them however the community naturally records things. Written, audio, video. The medium matters less than the preservation. 3 stories is enough to start. The library grows from there. This year, designate successors for every critical role. Have the role succession conversation with each current role holder, not as a mortality conversation, as an architecture conversation. If you weren't available for 6 months, who would do this? What would they need to know? How do we make sure that knowledge exists outside of you? And schedule the first annual architecture review. Put it in the calendar now. Give it half a day. Use the 5-pillar framework. Treat it as infrastructure maintenance, because that is exactly what it is. Ongoing. Practice the complete architecture, not as separate systems, as one integrated practice. The barter economy is not separate from the relationship architecture. Every trade is a relationship maintenance event. Every fulfilled agreement is a trust deposit. Every graceful exit clause honored is a community norm reinforced. The conflict resolution protocol is not separate from the identity architecture. Every dispute resolved with dignity is a community's identity being expressed under pressure. Every reckoning successfully completed is a community knowing itself more clearly than it did before. The outside threat protocol is not separate from the transmission architecture. Every contact correctly handled is a story for the library. Every designated responder who executes the protocol is an apprentice demonstrating competence that will eventually be passed to the next responder. The architecture is not 5 things. It is one thing expressed in 5 dimensions. And the community that understands this, that lives inside the architecture rather than executing its individual components, is a community that lasts. Let's end with what this has always been about. Not survival, not preparation, not protocols or systems or checklists or frameworks. Sovereignty, the specific, earned, practiced, daily sovereignty of human beings who have chosen not to be dependent on systems they did not build and cannot control, who have chosen instead to build something themselves. Something that works because they made it work. Something that holds because they chose to hold it. Something that lasts because they decided it would last and made every decision, built every relationship, transmitted every piece of knowledge with that decision as the North Star. This is what Gen X built, not in institutions, not with funding, not with permission, in garages and kitchens and backyards, in the specific ordinary spaces where human beings have always built the things that matter, with their hands, with their words, with their presence, with a specific stubborn refusal to believe that the system's failure meant their failure, that the bank's closure meant their community's closure, that the institution's collapse meant the collapse of everything that the institution was supposed to protect. Gen X watched every institution they were told to trust reveal its actual priorities under pressure, and instead of despair, instead of rage, instead of the specific paralysis of people whose worldview has been proven wrong, they built something. They built the barter economy. They built the conflict resolution protocol. They built the outside threat response. They built the legacy transmission system. They built the identity architecture. They built everything a community needs to survive, function, and persist without institutional support, without digital infrastructure, without anyone's permission. And now they are at the kitchen table, in the garage, in the backyard at dusk, looking at you, not with urgency, not with fear, with the specific calm of people who have done their part and are ready to give it to whoever is prepared to receive it. The only question that remains after 4 episodes, is this: are you prepared to receive it? Not to know it, to receive it, to carry it, to apply it, to practice it until it becomes a culture of your community, and not just the knowledge of one person within it, to transmit it to the generation after you, with the same completeness and honesty that Gen X is transmitting it to you right now, because that is the actual legacy code, not the barter system, not the conflict protocol, not the threat response. The legacy code is a decision to carry knowledge forward, to treat what you have received as a responsibility, not just a resource, to understand that you are not the end of this transmission. You are the middle of it, and the generation that comes after you, the children in the yards of the communities you're building right now, they are waiting for what you're going to give them, the same way you were waiting for what Gen X is giving you now. 4 episodes, 5 pillars, 1 complete architecture, the Gen X legacy code, now yours. Use it, practice it, teach it, not because a crisis is coming, because a generation is. This is the end of the Silent Barter System series. 4 episodes, the complete Gen X survival architecture, from the barter economy to the legacy code, fully documented for the first time. If this series gave you something real, you know what to do with it, and you know what to do next.